Walking through the quiet forests of England, you might come across something unexpected: moss-covered stones peeking through the undergrowth, the faint outline of a forgotten road, or the crumbling remains of a cottage swallowed by time. These silent ruins were once bustling medieval villages filled with life, laughter, and the daily rhythms of hundreds of people. Yet today, they stand empty, their stories whispered only by the wind. How does an entire village simply vanish? This isn't the plot of a ghost story. It's a real historical mystery that stretches across Europe and beyond. From sudden calamities to slow, creeping changes, the disappearance of these settlements is a puzzle that historians have been piecing together for centuries. Picture this: a thriving community, its fields ripe with grain, its church bells ringing across the valley, its homes warm with hearth fires. Then, one day, the people are gone. The doors swing open to empty rooms, the fields grow wild, the village becomes a memory, then a legend, then a question mark. What happened here? The answers are as varied as the villages themselves. Some were wiped out by catastrophe, the relentless sweep of plague, the devastation of war. Others faded away quietly, victims of shifting trade routes or changing climates. And then there are those that seem to vanish overnight, leaving behind only rumors and unease. This is the story of those lost villages, the echoes of lives interrupted. It's a journey into the shadows of history, where every overgrown path and weathered stone has a tale to tell. We'll explore the chilling theories behind these abandonments, from the Black Death's merciless toll to the quiet economic shifts that rewrote the map of medieval Europe. Along the way, we'll uncover the clues left behind: fragments of pottery, hastily buried treasures, even the bones of those who called these places home. So join me as we step through the gates of these ghostly settlements, peeling back the layers of time to reveal the secrets of the villages that history forgot. The truth is waiting just beyond the tree line. To understand why the disappearance of medieval villages is so haunting, we first need to step into their world, a world woven from the rhythms of the earth and the bonds of community. Picture a cluster of thatched cottages nestled between open fields, their wooden frames leaning slightly with age. Smoke curls from hearth fires as families gather after a day's labor. The village mill turns steadily by the river, grinding grain into flour while the church spire rises above it all, a constant reminder of faith and order. This wasn't just a place to live, it was a living organism, where every person, crop, and animal played a part in sustaining the whole. At the heart of these villages lay the feudal system, a delicate web of obligations and protections. Peasants worked strips of land scattered across vast open fields, growing barley, wheat, and oats to feed their families and pay their dues to the local lord. In return, they received protection and the right to graze livestock on common pastures. It was a hard life, marked by backbreaking labor and the constant threat of poor harvests, but it was also one of interdependence. The blacksmith, the baker, the miller each had a role, and the village couldn't function without them. Even the layout of these settlements reflected their purpose, with homes clustered near shared resources like wells or forges, and fields radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. But what made these villages truly resilient was their adaptability. They weren't static relics, they evolved over centuries, adjusting to new crops, tools, and even climatic shifts. When the weather turned harsh, communities adapted their farming techniques. When trade routes shifted, they found new markets for their wool or ale. For generations, this balance held, allowing villages to weather famines, wars, and even the occasional outbreak of disease. Yet this very interconnectedness also made them vulnerable. A single catastrophic event, a failed harvest, an invading army, or a virulent plague could unravel the delicate threads holding the community together. The church wasn't just a spiritual center, it was the glue binding villagers to each other and to the rhythms of the year. Feast days marked the seasons, while the parish register recorded births, marriages, and deaths, proof that every life mattered. The mill wasn't merely a building, it was a symbol of shared effort where families brought their grain to be ground, exchanging news and gossip as they waited. Even the communal fields, divided into narrow strips, reinforced the idea that no one could thrive alone. This was a world where survival depended on cooperation, where the loss of even a few families could strain the entire system. When we walk through the ruins of these villages today, it's easy to see them as forgotten backdrops to history, but they were once vibrant, noisy, full of hope and struggle. Children played in the lanes, neighbors bartered goods at the market cross, elders passed down stories by firelight. Their disappearance wasn't just a change of address, it was the silencing of 1,000 daily rituals, the unraveling of a way of life that had endured for centuries. And that's why their empty footprints still haunt us. They remind us of how fragile our own communities might be, and how easily the echoes of a bustling village can fade into the wind. The year was 1348, and whispers of a terrible sickness had already reached the shores of England. No one could have imagined how quickly those whispers would become screams. The Black Death didn't just arrive, it erupted, tearing through villages like a wildfire with no regard for age, wealth, or status. Within months, entire communities were hollowed out. Beds lay unmade, meals half-eaten on tables, livestock wandering untended through empty streets. This wasn't just a disease, it was an eraser, wiping away generations of lives in a matter of weeks. Imagine a village where every second person you knew was suddenly gone. The miller who ground your flour, the woman who sold herbs at the market, the children who played by the river, all vanished, leaving behind silence and the lingering scent of decay. In some places, the death toll was so high that survivors couldn't even bury the dead properly. Mass graves, hurriedly dug at the edge of settlements, became grim landmarks. Archaeologists still uncover these pits today, their tangled skeletons telling stories of panic and desperation. One such grave in Lincolnshire held nearly 50 bodies, piled haphazardly, some still clinging to loved ones even in death. But the plague's aftermath was just as devastating as the outbreak itself. With so many laborers dead, fields lay fallow, harvests rotted where they stood. The few who survived often fled, seeking better opportunities in towns or on larger estates where their skills were suddenly in high demand. Abandoned cottages collapsed under the weight of neglect, their timber frames scavenged by neighboring villages. Over time, the forest crept back in, swallowing boundary stones and hearths alike. Places like Wharram, Percy in Yorkshire, once a thriving community, became ghostly echoes, their names lingering on maps long after the last resident had passed. The economic shockwaves were equally profound. With workers scarce, those who remained could demand higher wages, upending the feudal system that had governed rural life for centuries. Lords desperate to keep their land productive offered unheard of freedoms to peasants, loosening the chains of serfdom. It was a social revolution born from unimaginable loss. Yet for some villages, these changes came too late. Isolated settlements, already struggling with poor soil or harsh climates, found themselves beyond saving. Without enough hands to tend the fields or repair the buildings, their fate was sealed. What makes these abandoned villages so haunting isn't just the scale of death, it's the eerie normalcy left behind. Archaeologists find shoes still paired by doorways, toys dropped mid-play, even the bones of dogs curled up as if waiting for masters who never returned. These weren't just statistics, they were communities shattered mid-breath. And while some villages eventually repopulated, others became cautionary tales, their names whispered as warnings. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed places, erasing them from the landscape as thoroughly as if they'd never existed at all. Yet even in this darkness, there's a strange resilience to uncover. Some villages adapted in unexpected ways. A few, like I am in Derbyshire, chose self-imposed quarantine to spare neighboring towns, their sacrifice etched into local folklore. Others became pilgrimage sites, their ruined churches transformed into monuments to survival. The plague reshaped not just population charts, but the very soul of medieval Europe, leaving behind lessons about fragility, adaptation, and the indelible mark of collective loss. When we walk through these empty fields today, we're not just stepping over forgotten stones, we're walking through the shadow of a world remade by catastrophe. By the late 14th century, the countryside was humming with a quiet revolution, one not of swords and sieges, but of wool sacks and silver coins. As bustling market towns sprang up along trade routes, they cast a powerful spell over rural villages. Imagine a young farmer's son, calloused hands gripping a wooden plow, gazing at the distant smoke of a thriving town. There, apprentices earned wages in coin, not barley. There, a man could rise by skill rather than birth. The promise of freedom pulled people from their ancestral fields like a magnet, leaving behind half-tilled soil and crumbling cottages. This urban exodus didn't happen overnight. It began with small defections, a weaver here, a blacksmith there, drawn by the clatter of looms in places like Norwich or York. Guilds offered what no village could: regulated wages, social mobility, and protection under charters that treated craftsmen as more than property. A master mason in London could own land, marry freely, even vote, in some cases unthinkable luxuries for serfs bound to a lord's whim. As more artisans fled, villages lost the very tradespeople who kept them self-sufficient. Without a cooper to make barrels, how would grain be stored? Without a thatcher who'd mend the roofs before winter, the feudal system, once an unshakable pillar of rural life, began to crack under this pressure. Lords desperate to retain workers offered unprecedented concessions: shorter work weeks, rent paid in cash instead of labor, even land leases. In Suffolk, records show entire families negotiating their way out of serfdom by the 1400s, their contracts boldly stipulating freedoms unheard of a century prior. Yet for remote villages, these changes came too late. Isolated settlements with poor soil or harsh climates saw their populations drain away like water through a sieve. Places like Gainsthorpe in Lincolnshire became skeletal, their fields reverting to scrub, their empty lanes scoured by wind. Market towns didn't just steal people, they redirected the lifeblood of trade. Why barter eggs for nails at a village stall when a day's walk could bring you to a bustling fair with Flemish cloth and Spanish wine? As commerce concentrated in these hubs, rural markets withered. Archaeologists find haunting evidence of this shift. Coins minted after 1350 in abandoned villages are vanishingly rare, suggesting money itself stopped flowing there. Even the humble village mill, once a social and economic linchpin, fell silent as grain was carted to larger, more efficient operations. The landscape itself bore witness to this transformation. Open field systems, where strips of land were farmed communally, gave way to enclosed pastures for sheep, a far less labor-intensive crop. Wool became the new gold, and lords eager to profit fenced off common lands, evicting remaining tenants. In the Cotswolds, rolling fields once dotted with peasant plots became vast, empty grazing grounds. The medieval equivalent of "for rent" signs might as well have hung over villages like Titchfield in Hampshire. where the last resident reportedly left the key in the church door when they departed in 1420. Yet this economic shift wasn't purely tragic. For many, it meant liberation from backbreaking toil and the chance to reinvent themselves. A runaway serf named John Ball could become John the Chandler, lighting city streets with his wax candles. Women found opportunities as brewsters or silk workers, trades that offered independence unimaginable in feudal villages. The decline of rural life birthed a new social order, one where ambition and skill could outweigh birthright. Today, the scars of this transition linger in the earth. Aerial photographs reveal ghostly outlines where villages once stood, their former boundaries etched in soil discoloration or crop marks. In Norfolk, the lost village of Godwick survives only as a lonely tower amid wheat fields, a stark sentinel to economic forces that reshaped a continent. These places weren't failed, they were rendered obsolete by a world moving faster than oxen could plow. Their silence speaks not just of abandonment, but of the relentless tide of progress that still sweeps communities into history's shadows. The late 13th century dawned with a creeping chill that no one could ignore. Winters stretched longer, their icy fingers gripping the land well into what should have been spring. Summers, once reliable for ripening grain, now delivered only relentless rain or withering drought. This was the Little Ice Age, not a single catastrophic event, but a slow, insidious squeeze on medieval life. Villages that had thrived for generations found themselves fighting against an enemy they couldn't see, a climate shifting beneath their feet. Fields that once yielded bushels of wheat now produced stunted, blackened stalks. In Norfolk, records from 1321 describe peasants eating bread made from ground fern roots, their stomachs swollen with hunger. Livestock perished in droves during unusually harsh winters, their frozen carcasses dotting pastures like grim monuments. Without animals to pull plows or provide manure for fertilizer, the cycle of scarcity tightened its grip. Some communities resorted to eating seed grain, sacrificing next year's harvest for a few more weeks of life. The soil itself seemed to turn against them, waterlogged plots drowning crops in spring, then baking rock hard under summer suns that offered heat without rain. Yet it wasn't just starvation that emptied these villages. Climate change reshaped entire economies. In the Alps, advancing glaciers swallowed up mountain pastures, forcing herders to abandon centuries-old grazing routes. Coastal settlements watched helplessly as rising sea levels salted their fields, rendering the earth barren. The village of Dunwich in Suffolk, once a thriving port, lost nearly half its buildings to erosion between 1320 and 1450. With each storm, more houses toppled into the hungry sea until only the church tower remained, a solitary witness to nature's relentless reclamation. Archaeologists uncovering these lost settlements find haunting evidence of the choices people faced. At Wharram, Percy, fish bones in 14th century trash pits tell a story of desperation villagers turning to meager creek catches when their crops failed. In Scandinavia, abandoned farms reveal half-finished repairs, as if residents left mid-task, perhaps fleeing toward rumors of milder lands. Some communities fought back ingeniously, building elaborate drainage systems or switching to hardier crops like rye. But for every village that adapted, another faded into silence, its last inhabitants drifting away like leaves on a bitter wind. The cruelest twist, these climate shifts weren't uniform. While one valley suffered endless rains, another might bake under drought, creating patchwork survival where luck played as much a role as skill. Tax records from Burgundy show entire villages excused from payments due to the barrenness of the earth, their fields yielding more stones than grain. In Scotland, the abandoned township of Lowers whispers of this inequity. Its neighbors endured while Laowa's people vanished, their fate lost to time. What makes these climate-driven abandonments so poignant is their lingering visibility. Unlike plague deaths or economic shifts, environmental collapse left scars on the land itself. Terraces painstakingly carved into hillsides now stand empty, their purpose forgotten. Orchards that once bloomed pink with spring lie buried under centuries of forest growth. Even the names of these places sometimes betray their fate, like Cold Newton in Leicestershire, where cold tells of a village that could no longer outrun the creeping chill. Yet in this tragedy lies a lesson about resilience. Some communities didn't just flee, they transformed. In the Netherlands, villagers banded together to build dikes, turning the sea's threat into fertile polders. In Tuscany, farmers began grafting hardier rootstock onto vines, saving their wine industry. These weren't passive victims, but innovators fighting for survival. When we walk through the ruins of villages claimed by the Little Ice Age, we're not just seeing failure, we're witnessing humanity's age-old dance with an unpredictable planet, a dance that continues in our own era of climate uncertainty. The empty hearths and overgrown lanes ask us a silent question. How will future generations read the story of our own adaptations? War drums echoed across the valleys, a sound that sent villagers running for their livestock and children long before the first plume of smoke appeared on the horizon. Medieval warfare wasn't just battles between armored knights, it was a brutal strategy of starvation and terror, where burning a village could be more effective than defeating an army in the field. Picture the scene: soldiers torching thatched roofs, trampling ripening grain underfoot, poisoning wells with animal carcasses. These weren't accidents of war, but calculated acts meant to cripple an enemy's ability to feed and fund their forces. Within hours, generations of labor could be reduced to charred timbers and scattered belongings. Some of the most chilling disappearances trace back to the 100 Years' War, where English and French forces turned the countryside into a chessboard of destruction. In Normandy, records speak of villages like Saint-Lô-sur-Lauzon, where not a single house remained standing after English raids in the 1340s. The tactic was simple: leave no resources for the enemy to use, but the human cost was staggering. Peasants who couldn't flee to walled towns often perished in the flames or succumbed to exposure in nearby forests. Archaeologists still find their traces: a child's shoe buried in ash, a cooking pot shattered mid-meal, the skeleton of a family huddled together in their collapsed cellar. Yet not all abandonments were acts of aggression. Some villages became casualties of defensive strategies. During the Scottish Wars of Independence, entire communities along the border were forcibly relocated, a medieval version of a scorched earth policy. Why risk your enemy occupying a village when you could burn it first? The abandoned settlement of Roxburgh in Scotland tells this story. Once a thriving market town, it was systematically dismantled by retreating forces in the 1400s, its stones scattered to prevent rebuilding. Over time, even the memory of its exact location faded, leaving only a name on old maps and a faint outline in the grass. The psychological toll of constant warfare reshaped rural life in unexpected ways. Villages began clustering closer to castles for protection, altering centuries-old settlement patterns. In Tuscany, hilltop towns still bear witness to this shift, their narrow streets designed as defensive labyrinths against raiders. But remote farming hamlets, they stood little chance. Places like Ambion Hill in England, now just a lonely field, were simply erased, their residents absorbed into larger, safer communities. Tax rolls from the period reveal haunting details. Nothing collected: the tenants are dead or fled. Scribes wrote beside village after village. What makes these war-torn abandonments uniquely tragic is the deliberate nature of their destruction. Unlike plague or economic change, this wasn't an impersonal force of nature or shifting trade winds. These villages were targeted, their existence deemed collateral in someone else's conflict. Modern LiDAR scans reveal ghostly outlines beneath fields, the precise rectangles of burned longhouses, the grid of streets that never recovered. At the lost village of Tusmore in Oxfordshire, local legend claims the earth remains barren where blood soaked the ground during a 14th century massacre. Whether true or not, the story persists, a folk memory of violence written into the landscape. Yet even in this darkness, glimmers of resilience emerge. Some villagers returned years later, rebuilding atop the ashes. In France's Provence region, archaeologists found a farmstead where residents had carefully buried their tools before fleeing, a time capsule of hope meant for retrieval. Others adapted ingeniously, like the inhabitants of Montelou in the Pyrenees, who rebuilt their homes with hidden escape tunnels after repeated raids. War could erase a village from the map, but not always from the hearts of those who called it home. When we stand in these empty fields today, we're not just looking at absence, we're witnessing the enduring echo of choices made in impossible circumstances, where survival sometimes meant leaving everything behind. The rustle of sheep grazing on lush green pastures might seem peaceful today, but 500 years ago, that sound signaled the death knell for countless medieval villages. Across England and Europe, wealthy landowners made a cold calculation, one that would reshape the countryside forever. Why lease strips of land to dozens of peasant families when you could consolidate fields into vast sheep runs? A single shepherd could tend hundreds of animals, their wool fetching premium prices from booming textile industries in Flanders and Italy. And so began the ruthless process known as enclosure, where common lands that had sustained villages for generations were suddenly fenced off, locked away behind hedges and ditches. For the peasant farmer watching surveyors stake out boundaries where his family had tilled the soil for centuries, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an existential threat. Common lands weren't merely extra space, they were the lifeblood of village survival. Here, families gathered firewood, grazed their cows, foraged for berries and medicinal herbs. The loss of these shared resources meant the difference between subsistence and starvation. In places like Norfolk's deserted village of Godwick, archaeological evidence shows how quickly this unraveled communities. Excavations reveal abandoned plows mid-furrow, as if farmers walked away mid-task when the fences went up. The legal mechanisms behind enclosure were as methodical as they were merciless. Lords petitioned Parliament for private acts authorizing the seizure of common land, often with little regard for those who depended on it. Some villagers received small cash payouts, paltry sums that barely covered a year's rent elsewhere. Others were simply evicted, their cottages razed to prevent squatters. Court rolls from Leicestershire tell of desperate resistance, peasants tearing down fences under cover of darkness, smuggling livestock onto enclosed pastures, even resorting to arson. But the tide was unstoppable. Between 1500 and 1600, nearly half of England's open fields vanished behind hedgerows. The transformation of the landscape was both swift and haunting. Where once there had been a patchwork of small plots, each strip reflecting a different family's labor, now stretched monotonous sheep pastures. Villages like Whatborough in Rutland simply ceased to exist. Their names linger only in dusty tax records marked waste. Aerial photographs reveal ghostly outlines beneath the grass, the faint geometry of plow lines frozen in time, the shadowy rectangles of long demolished homes. Even the soil itself bears witness. Enclosed fields show markedly different chemical signatures from centuries of concentrated grazing, while abandoned village sites often yield surprising bursts of wildflowers, descendants of medieval herb gardens gone to seed. This wasn't just an agricultural shift, but a cultural earthquake. The feudal system had revolved around reciprocal obligations. Peasants worked the land in exchange for protection. Enclosure severed that contract, replacing it with a stark new reality: land as pure commodity. Suddenly, a lord's wealth wasn't measured in loyal tenants but in acres and fleeces. The social fabric unraveled as migrating villagers flooded into cities, becoming the urban poor who would later fuel the Industrial Revolution. Their resentment simmered for generations, erupting in revolts like the Pilgrimage of Grace and Kett's Rebellion, where protesters demanded the return of common land. Yet the story of Enclosure isn't one of simple villains and victims. Some historians argue it spurred agricultural innovation, enabling crop rotation and selective breeding impossible under the open field system. The wool trade did bring fleeting prosperity to regions like the Cotswolds, where wool churches still stand as monuments to that golden age. Even the displaced villagers weren't always passive. Many became the artisans and laborers who built early modern Europe's bustling towns. What lingers most powerfully are the absences. Walk through the Lincolnshire wolds today, and you might stumble upon a solitary church tower rising from empty fields, all that remains of a once thriving community. These lone sentinels whisper a cautionary tale about progress's collateral damage, about how economic winds can erase whole ways of life. The Enclosure movement didn't just change how land was used, it redefined what land meant, setting the stage for our modern notions of property and displacement. When we see those quiet pastures now, we're not just looking at grass and sheep, we're seeing the echoes of a revolution that turned villagers into vagrants and common soil into private real estate. Imagine standing at a crossroads in the year 1300, watching Oxcart's Creek passed piled high with dismantled roof beams, bundles of thatch, even disassembled looms. This wasn't a scene of panic or disaster. It was a carefully orchestrated relocation, ordered by a lord or bishop with a grander vision in mind. While plagues and economic shifts erased villages through chaos, some disappearances were meticulously planned, their ruins telling a story of cold calculation rather than tragedy. Take the case of Old Winchelsea, a bustling port on England's southern coast. When relentless storms and shifting tides made its harbour untenable, King Edward I didn't just abandon it, he commanded the entire town to move 2 miles inland. Surveyors laid out a geometric grid of streets for New Winchelsea, while the old settlement slowly surrendered to the sea. Today, fishermen occasionally pull medieval bricks from the waves, remnants of a town sacrificed to progress. Similar fates befell villages near newly built monasteries, where Cistercian monks sought isolation in remote valleys, but soon required supporting settlements at a discreet distance. The original hamlets left to crumble, their stones scavenged for grander projects. These relocations weren't just practical, they were power plays etched into the landscape. When a lord like the Earl of Cornwall decided to expand his hunting grounds, villages like Trethergy found themselves dismantled stone by stone, their residents resettled along newly drawn boundaries. Church authorities wielded equal authority, uprooting communities deemed too close to sacred sites or too rowdy for monastic neighbors. At Wharram, Percy, archaeologists found something peculiar. The village wasn't simply abandoned but systematically demolished. Door hinges were carefully removed, hearthstones pried up for reuse, and the church deliberately deconsecrated. This wasn't neglect, it was a message written in rubble. The logistics of medieval relocation reveal astonishing organization. Tax records from Normandy show detailed compensation lists. Peasant John gets 3 silver coins for his apple trees. Widow Matilda receives 5 for her vegetable plot. Some lords even provided timber for rebuilding, though often with strings attached. In Sweden's Uppland province, an entire village was moved to make way for a royal estate. but the new location came with higher rents and stricter labor obligations. Resistance did occur. Court rolls mention fines for families who sneaked back to their ancestral fields, but defiance rarely prevailed against armed retainers and legal decrees. What makes these planned abandonments uniquely unsettling is their lingering order. Unlike plague villages frozen in chaos or war-torn ruins scarred by violence, these sites show deliberate erasure. At the German village of Hohenrode, excavators mapped foundations revealing a startling pattern. Every house had been methodically stripped of valuables before walls were toppled inward, like closing a book on a finished chapter. Even the graveyards were relocated, with some lords going so far as to pay for the reinterment of bones in new churchyards. This wasn't just moving people, it was rewriting history itself. Yet within this control, flashes of quiet rebellion surface. In Dorset's deserted village of Milton Abbas, relocated to make way for an earl's vanity project, folk tales persist about a secret midnight procession, villagers carrying their church bells to the new site against orders, burying them beneath the crossroads as a permanent protest. Whether true or not, the story endures, a testament to how even the most calculated plans couldn't completely erase the human spirit. When we walk through these curated ruins today, we're not just seeing abandonment, we're seeing the fingerprints of power and the fragile marks left by those who had no choice but to follow its commands. The river had been their lifeblood for generations, its waters turning mill wheels, irrigating fields, carrying trade boats laden with grain. Then came the Great Flood of 1312, when the rains didn't stop for 40 days. Swollen beyond recognition, the river burst its banks with a roar heard miles away, carving a new channel overnight. By dawn, the village of Nenningham stood half-submerged, its churchyard graves gaping open as water swallowed the lower cottages. Within a year, the settlement was abandoned, its survivors rebuilding on higher ground. This wasn't an isolated tragedy, but a recurring nightmare for medieval communities living at nature's mercy. Coastal villages faced an even more relentless enemy. At Dunwich on England's Suffolk coast, parish records tell of a thriving port with 8 churches, its harbour bristling with fishing vessels. Then the sea began its slow conquest. Storms in 1326 claimed 300 houses in a single night. By 1500, the once grand St. Peter's Church tumbled into the waves, its bells reportedly ringing underwater during storms, a ghostly warning of nature's power. Today, Dunwich exists mostly as a scattering of stones beneath the surf, its outline visible only during extreme low tides. Fishermen still dredge up medieval roof tiles worn smooth by centuries of currents. In mountainous regions, the threat came from above. The alpine village of Pleurs in Switzerland had stood for 400 years when disaster struck in 1618. After weeks of torrential rain, an entire mountainside collapsed, burying the town under 60 feet of mud and rock. Over 900 people perished in minutes, their homes crushed like eggshells. Modern geologists studying the site found evidence this wasn't the first time. Layers of debris revealed older settlements swallowed by earlier landslides. The villagers had unknowingly rebuilt atop their ancestors' graves. What makes these disaster sites uniquely haunting is their suddenness. Unlike villages fading from economic change, these places often vanished mid-stride. At the lost Welsh village of Capel Celyn, archaeologists uncovered a loaf of bread petrified in a collapsed oven, its last meal never eaten. In Germany's Harz Mountains, the abandoned mining town of Andriesberg preserves boot prints frozen in mud that became stone-fleeing footsteps from a landslide that never released its victims. These weren't planned abandonments but snapshots of interrupted lives. Yet even in catastrophe, ingenuity flourished. Some villages adapted with remarkable foresight. In the Netherlands, communities built artificial mounds called turpen to ride out floods, their elevated churches serving as last resort refuges. Venetian engineers developed early warning systems, bronze bells strung along vulnerable coasts to alert villagers to rising tide. Others learned to read the land's warnings, abandoning sites at the first signs of instability. The deserted Cornish village of Treloihen tells this story. Its residents left after noticing spring water turning muddy, a subtle hint of impending subsidence that saved countless lives. The cruelest irony, many disaster sites became traps through no fault of their inhabitants. Medieval farmers couldn't know their fertile valley sat atop unstable glacial deposits, or that their seaside cliffs contained layers of erodible sandstone. Modern technology reveals what they couldn't see. Satellite imagery shows entire medieval field systems now underwater off Denmark's coast, their furrows perfectly preserved beneath the waves. Ground-penetrating radar uncovers village outlines beneath alpine meadows, their destruction caused by long-forgotten earthquakes. These ruins offer sobering lessons about resilience. The Breton village of Wise, legend says, was swallowed by the sea after its princess opened floodgates during a storm. While likely myth, the story endures as a warning about human vulnerability. Yet equally compelling are the success stories like the Italian hill town of Crocco, abandoned after landslides in 1963, but whose evacuated residents built a thriving new community nearby. When we walk these vanished villages today, we're not just seeing failure, we're witnessing humanity's endless negotiation with an unpredictable earth, a dance where sometimes the ground itself decides the steps. The year was 1536, and the hammer blows echoing through England's countryside weren't from blacksmiths or carpenters. They were the sound of monastic walls being torn apart. When Henry VIII's commissioners arrived at a monastery like Revolks in Yorkshire, they didn't just disband the monks, they dismantled an entire economic ecosystem. For centuries, these religious houses had been the invisible scaffolding holding up rural life. They employed masons and scribes, bought wool from local shepherds, distributed alms to the poor, and even maintained crucial infrastructure like bridges and mills. Overnight, that safety net vanished, leaving villages to tumble into oblivion like books ripped from a shelf. Consider the fate of villages like Ouston in Lincolnshire. Before the dissolution, its abbey provided work for nearly 200 people, farmhands tending its vast estates, brewers supplying its kitchens, weavers producing vestments. The abbey's bakery alone fed dozens of families with leftover bread. When the king's men seized the property, those jobs evaporated. The abbey's lands were sold off to wealthy courtiers who had no interest in maintaining charitable traditions. Within a decade, Ouston's population halved, its cottages standing empty as former tenants drifted toward towns in search of work. Similar stories unfolded across England, places like Whalley in Lancashire, where the abbey's closure triggered a domino effect, bankrupting local tradesmen who'd relied on monastic contracts. But the crisis ran deeper than lost wages. Monasteries had been medieval welfare systems, offering everything from medical care to disaster relief. At Glastonbury, the monks operated a hospital that treated villagers for free. In Durham, the priory stored surplus grain to distribute during famines. When these institutions fell, so did the safety nets they'd woven. Parish records from Norfolk show shocking spikes in vagrancy and starvation deaths in the 1540s, direct echoes of monastic dissolution. Even the landscape bore witness. Fields once meticulously tended by lay brothers grew wild, their boundary markers swallowed by brambles. The cultural loss was equally devastating. Monasteries weren't just employers, they were repositories of knowledge and identity. their scribes had recorded village births and marriages for generations. Their libraries held charters proving land ownership documents that often disappeared into the pockets of new owners, leaving peasants unable to prove their rights to fields they'd worked for centuries. In Suffolk, the abandoned village of Leston tells this story in its ruins. After its abbey closed, the surrounding farms became disputed territory, their legal ties to the land erased along with the monastic records. Families who'd lived there for generations were suddenly trespassers, yet the dissolution's aftermath wasn't uniformly bleak. Some villages adapted shrewdly. Near Fountains Abbey, enterprising families turned monastic fish ponds into commercial fisheries, selling catches to nearby markets. In Cornwall, former monastic tin miners formed cooperatives to keep operations running. These survivors remind us that history rarely offers simple narratives of loss. Even in collapse, there were threads of reinvention. What lingers most hauntingly are the ghostly footprints of these abbey-dependent villages. Modern archaeologists using ground-penetrating radar at sites like Hales in Gloucestershire can trace the outlines of cottages clustered tightly around the monastery walls, homes that stood empty by 1550. The stones whisper of a world where faith and economics were inseparable, where the fall of a single institution could erase a community as thoroughly as any plague. When we walk these fields today, we're not just stepping over old foundations, we're walking through the shadow of England's first corporate downsizing, a warning about how fragile prosperity can be when too many depend on too few. Long after the last hearth fire cooled in these abandoned villages, something peculiar happened. The empty lanes and crumbling walls began breathing new life into local folklore. Across Europe, whispered tales of phantom church bells and ghostly processions kept the memory of these places alive, transforming physical ruins into landscapes of the imagination. In the Scottish Highlands, the deserted township of Lowers gained a chilling reputation when shepherds reported seeing shadowy figures moving through its roofless houses at dusk. Some claimed to hear faint Gaelic singing rising from the ground where the village once stood, though not a soul remained for miles. These weren't just campfire stories, they were cultural scars, a way for communities to process the unsettling void left behind when neighbors vanished. The legends often carried fragments of historical truth, warped by time into something stranger. Take the English village of Seathwaite, abandoned after repeated flooding in the 1500s. Locals soon spoke of a spectral, drowned congregation appearing in the flooded churchyard during storms, their faces eerily visible beneath the water's surface. Modern historians note this matches accounts of a real disaster in 1542, when flash floods trapped villagers inside the church. The folklore became an unspoken memorial, preserving tragedy through generations who'd never known the place as anything but ruins. Similarly, in Germany's Harz Mountains, tales of the Midnight Reapers, ghostly figures scything invisible crops, likely stem from the very real displacement of peasant farmers during the Enclosure movements. Some abandoned villages developed reputations as cursed spaces, their names spoken in warning. The Breton settlement of Wise, swallowed by the sea according to legend, was said to reappear on foggy mornings, its doomed inhabitants forever reliving their final moments. Archaeologists now believe Wise may reference several coastal villages lost to erosion, their collective fate distilled into a single cautionary myth. In Italy's Apennine Mountains, the ruined village of Monterano became known as a gathering place for witches, a stigma that conveniently discouraged looters from plundering its abandoned palazzo. These stories functioned as medieval keep-out signs, protecting dangerous ruins while explaining their eerie silence. The folk rituals tied to these ghost villages reveal even deeper layers of meaning. In Dorset, well into the 19th century, villagers would leave small offerings at the overgrown foundations of Milton Abbas, a handful of grain, a ribbon tied to a branch, though no one could recall exactly why. Anthropologists recognize this as liminal practice, a way to acknowledge spaces that exist between memory and oblivion. Similar traditions persisted in Wales, where parents warned children away from the ruins of Capel Selen by claiming the stones wept at night. The invented horror masked a more profound grief for a community forcibly relocated during reservoir construction in 1965. What makes these legends so hauntingly beautiful is their duality. They're neither pure fiction nor straightforward history, but something in between. When Danish farmers spoke of elverfolk dancing in the abandoned village of Torp, they were likely remembering the real displaced Romani families who once camped there. The Irish tale of a phantom banquet at the deserted settlement of Slevemore probably echoes memories of communal feasts before famine scattered its people. Folklore became the needle and thread that patched fragments of truth into stories durable enough to outlast stone walls. Today, these tales offer us a way to listen for voices the archives can't capture. Tax records might tell us how many people lived in Wharram, Percy, but only the legend of its singing graves, said to chime when the wind blows from the east, hints at the songs they might have loved. A crumbling cottage outline shows where someone slept, but the local story about a ghostly light in its window suggests how dearly they were missed. These villages didn't just disappear, they were transformed, their essence distilled into stories that walk the twilight between history and imagination. When we repeat them now, we're not just entertaining, we're keeping faith with those who once called these empty places home. Beneath the tangled roots of an ancient oak tree, a glint of metal catches the archaeologist's eye, a rusted key, still clutched in the skeletal fingers of a woman buried hastily just outside the village cemetery. This single artifact speaks volumes. She was running from something when she fell, gripping the key to a home she'd never see again. Such discoveries in abandoned medieval villages aren't just relics, they're frozen moments of human drama, waiting centuries to be witnessed. Take the excavation of Wharram, Percy in Yorkshire, where researchers uncovered something startling beneath the church floor: dozens of infant bones, carefully arranged in a pattern that defied Christian burial customs. Further study revealed these were likely victims of famine or disease, interred with desperate tenderness by grieving parents. Nearby, the remains of a young man showed signs of violent trauma, his skull fractured by what might have been a war axe or farming tool repurposed in conflict. These aren't just statistics, they're visceral connections to people who laughed, loved, and feared as we do. Pottery shards tell their own layered stories. In the deserted German village of Hohenrode, archaeologists found cooking pots still scorched from final meals, some containing traces of barley porridge mixed with unusual weeds, evidence of food shortages. Contrast that with the luxurious imported jugs discovered at Titchfield Abbey, their vibrant Spanish glaze hinting at the wealth that flowed through monastic communities before Henry VIII's dissolution. Even something as simple as a child's toy, a wooden top carved with initials, unearthed in Normandy's lost village of Saint Etienne, can bridge centuries, reminding us that childhood play transcended even the darkest eras. The ground itself holds forensic clues to village life and death. Soil analysis at Gainsthorpe revealed startlingly high levels of lead in abandoned house plots, suggesting contamination from primitive smelting operations may have contributed to health crises. At Dunwich, the coastal village swallowed by the sea, dendrochronology of salvaged timbers showed frantic repair attempts before the final storm, notches cut by axes in a race against time. Some of the most haunting finds come from latrine pits, where preserved seeds and parasite eggs reconstruct diets and diseases with startling precision. A cesspit in abandoned Swedish village Scramble contained remnants of fish bones and raspberries, alongside eggs of intestinal worms that likely plagued the entire community. Technology has revolutionized these investigations. LiDAR scans over English woodlands revealed the ghostly outlines of complete villages no one knew existed, their field systems etched into the earth like shadow drawings. In Italy's Apennine Mountains, thermal imaging detected the faint heat signatures of long-collapsed bread ovens beneath meadows, proof that even the most thoroughly erased settlements leave thermal fingerprints. Perhaps most moving are the facial reconstructions made from skulls, like the elderly woman from Wharram, Percy, whose likeness now gazes from museum displays, her toothless smile challenging us to see her as more than a statistic. These discoveries do more than fill gaps in historical records. They force us to confront our shared humanity. When archaeologists found a pair of shoes side by side in a Norfolk village ruins, perfectly preserved in anaerobic clay, they weren't just looking at 14th century footwear. They were witnessing someone's last act, perhaps a mother placing her child's shoes safely aside before fleeing floodwaters. Every rusted nail, every shattered loom weight, every scorched grain of wheat whispers the same truth. These weren't just abandoned villages. They were homes where people dreamed of better harvests, whispered secrets to lovers, and rocked babies to sleep until history interrupted. England's rolling green landscapes hold secrets beneath their grassy surfaces, hidden outlines of homes, streets, and churches that once pulsed with life. Over 3,000 deserted medieval villages have been identified across the country, their stories etched into the earth like invisible ink waiting to be read. Among them, Wharram, Percy stands as one of the most revealing, its excavated bones offering an intimate glimpse into the daily rhythms of medieval existence. Step into the remains of Wharram, Percy, and you're not just walking through ruins, you're stepping into a snapshot of the 14th century. The outlines of longhouses, their stone foundations still visible, show how families shared space with their livestock, warmth from animals helping combat England's bitter winters. The village church, though roofless, still stands sentinel over the site, its weathered stones bearing the marks of countless hands that shaped them. Archaeologists have uncovered everything from delicate bone combs to rusted farming tools, each artifact whispering about the people who once called this place home. A child's wooden toy, half-carved and abandoned, speaks of play interrupted. A broken cooking pot, its base scorched from countless meals, hints at evenings gathered around the hearth. What makes these villages so fascinating isn't just their abandonment, it's their ordinariness. These weren't grand castles or cathedral cities, but the working heart of medieval England, where blacksmiths, bakers, and farmers lived out their lives. The layout of Wharram, Percy reveals a carefully organized community, houses clustered near shared resources, garden plots marked by low stone walls, and a mill pond that once powered the grinding of grain. These details paint a vivid picture of a self-sufficient world, where every person had a role and every task was tied to the seasons. Yet these sites also hold darker stories. At Wharram, Percy, excavations uncovered something chilling: human bones with cut marks, dumped unceremoniously in the village's fish pond. Further study suggested these were victims of corpse mutilation, possibly an attempt to prevent the dead from rising during plague years. It's a grim reminder that these villages weren't just abandoned peacefully. Some fell to violence, panic, or desperation. Other sites reveal similar tragedies. The lost village of Gainsthorpe in Lincolnshire shows signs of hurried departure, with tools and household items left where they were last used, as if people fled suddenly and never returned. Modern technology has allowed us to see these villages in ways earlier archaeologists couldn't. LiDAR scans reveal ghostly field systems beneath modern farmland, showing how medieval farmers divided the land into narrow strips for cropping. Soil analysis can detect centuries-old manure deposits, tracing where livestock were kept. Even the pollen trapped in ancient layers of mud tells a story, showing which crops were grown and when the landscape began to revert to wilderness. These techniques have uncovered villages that left no visible trace above ground, their existence preserved only in subtle variations in soil color or the faint outlines of plow marks. The preservation of these sites varies dramatically. Some, like Wharram Percy, were lucky their remote locations spared them from being plowed under or built over. Others survive only as faint earthworks, visible at certain times of year when the light hits the fields just right. A few, like the drowned village of Hallsands in Devon, were claimed by the sea, their remains occasionally exposed by storm tides. Each tells a different chapter of England's rural history, from prosperous settlements that thrived for centuries to hamlets that flickered out after just a few generations. What's most striking is how these villages force us to rethink our connection to the land. The medieval countryside wasn't the timeless, unchanging landscape we often imagine. It was dynamic, shaped by human hands and vulnerable to collapse. Walking through Wharram Percy today, with its empty house platforms and silent church, it's impossible not to wonder about the last person to close that door, to bank that fire, to look back at the place they called home. These villages aren't just relics of the past, they're mirrors, reflecting the fragility of any community in any era. Their silent stones ask us what traces our own lives might leave behind, and who, centuries from now, might piece together our stories from the fragments we've left behind. The church bell that once called villagers to mass now swings silently in the wind, its rope long crumbled to dust. In medieval Europe, these sacred spaces weren't just buildings, they were the living pulse of community life. Picture the scene each Sunday, farmers scrubbing dirt from their hands before entering, children fidgeting on rough-hewn benches, the scent of candle wax mixing with the earthy musk of damp wool. The church was where births were celebrated, marriages blessed, and the dead mourned, a constant through every season of life. Its walls absorbed generations of whispered prayers and hymns, its ledger recording every baptism and burial in careful Latin script. When a village faded away, this last structure standing became a stark monument to all that had been lost. Beyond spiritual solace, churches functioned as medieval community centers. The porch doubled as a courtroom where local disputes were settled. Notice boards displayed royal proclamations next to notices of lost livestock. After services, the churchyard buzzed with gossip and bartering, eggs exchanged for mending, news from distant relatives shared over loaves of bread. In winter, the nave might shelter travelers. In drought, processions circled fields praying for rain. The very architecture reflected this dual role: heavy doors to protect tithed grain stores, sturdy towers serving as lookout points against raiders. At Wharram Percy, archaeologists found gaming pieces tucked between floorboards, suggesting even leisurely gatherings unfolded in this sacred space. The abandonment of these churches tells a story of slow unraveling. First, the stained glass shattered and wasn't replaced. Then the roof leaked, its timbers too costly to repair. Finally, the last priest packed his vestments and walked away, leaving the altar to the spiders. In coastal Dunwich, the sea claimed 6 churches one by one, their congregations dwindling with each storm until the final parishioners carried their statues inland. Elsewhere, repurposed churches whisper of adaptation. The roofless chapel at Knowlton in Dorset stands within a Neolithic stone circle, its Norman arches framing pagan stones, a testament to how sacred spaces could transcend faiths. What makes these ruins so poignant is what they represent beyond religion. The graffiti-scratched pilgrim marks at Canterbury's St. Mary's speak of hope, the worn steps at St. Peter's in Heysham bear witness to centuries of footfalls. When wolves prowled the forests and plague stalked the lanes, the church offered light in literal darkness, its candles a beacon against the night. To lose this anchor meant more than losing a place to pray. It meant losing the rhythm that structured village time, from Candlemas to harvest festival. Modern visitors often feel the weight of this absence. In the lonely Norfolk ruins of St. Mary's Houghton, wildflowers grow where pews once stood, their seeds carried by birds through broken windows. The silence here is different from other ruins, not just missing people, but missing prayers. Yet even in decay, these spaces command reverence. At dusk, when slanting light catches crumbling frescoes of saints, it's easy to understand why some believe certain churches were built where heaven touched earth. Their stones may fall, but the stories they hold of faith, community, and resilience refuse to be forgotten. The summer of 1381 burned hotter than England had seen in generations, not just from the sun, but from the fury of thousands of peasants marching on London. What began as protests over an unpopular poll tax erupted into full-scale rebellion, with villagers torching manorial records and throwing open prison gates. For a few chaotic weeks, the feudal system itself seemed to tremble. Though King Richard II eventually crushed the revolt, its aftershocks rippled through the countryside for decades, leaving abandoned villages in their wake. Take the fate of villages like Bocking in Essex, where the revolt's ringleaders had rallied their followers. After the rebellion's failure, royal troops swept through, hanging suspected rebels from the very oaks where they'd planned their uprising. Terrified survivors fled into the forests, their cottages left to crumble. Tax records from 1400 show Bocking's population halved, not from plague or famine, but from deliberate dispersion. Similar patterns emerged across East Anglia, where manorial lords, once confident in their control, now viewed dense peasant settlements as powder kegs. Some actively encouraged their workers to scatter, offering incentives to relocate to smaller, more manageable hamlets. The psychological impact was equally transformative. Before the revolt, villagers had dared demand the abolition of serfdom when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, their rallying cry asked. Though they failed, the genie couldn't be rebottled. Lords who once treated peasants as property now faced workers who knew their collective power. In Suffolk, the deserted village of Kettlebaston tells this story in its empty fields after the revolt. Its lord abandoned attempts to enforce old labor dues, leaving the settlement to wither as peasants drifted toward towns offering wages and freedoms. Archaeological evidence reveals the rebellion's scars in unexpected ways. At the lost village of Newton in Cambridgeshire, excavators found a cache of coins buried beneath a hearth, likely a rebel's hidden savings, never reclaimed. In Norfolk, the outlines of several cottages show signs of being dismantled in haste, their timbers carted away under cover of darkness. These weren't orderly relocations but desperate flights, with families abandoning generations of roots to escape retribution. Even the landscape bore witness. Some lords converted formerly communal fields into sheep pastures, not for profit, but to eliminate gathering places where discontent might brew again. Yet the revolt's legacy wasn't purely destructive. In its wake, the feudal system began unraveling faster than anyone could have predicted. Lords fearing another uprising gradually replaced forced labor with cash rents. Skilled peasants, now aware of their worth, negotiated better terms or left for cities where their talents commanded wages. The deserted villages dotting England's countryside became unintended monuments to this social transformation, places where the old order collapsed under its own weight. When we walk these fields today, we're not just seeing abandonment, we're seeing the birth pangs of a new world, where common people first glimpsed their power to shape history. The fields of Normandy lay fallow for years, their furrows choked with weeds where wheat should have grown. This was the hidden toll of the 100 Years' War, not just the battles that filled chronicles, but the slow starvation of villages cut off from their men and means of survival. When the king's recruiters came through demanding soldiers, they took not only young men but the very backbone of rural life. Blacksmiths traded hammers for swords, millers abandoned their grinding stones, and shepherds left flocks untended. Those who returned, if they returned at all, often came home to find their cottages roofless, their orchards wild, their families gone. Consider the fate of villages like Castellan in southwestern France, where the final battle of the war raged in 1453. Archaeological surveys reveal a chilling pattern. The village cemetery holds far more women and children than men, with mass graves suggesting deaths from malnutrition rather than violence. Without hands to bring in the harvest, communities that had endured for centuries collapsed within a generation. In England's Sussex Downs, the abandoned settlement of Pevensey Levels tells a similar story. Tax records show its population plummeted after repeated French coastal raids, the survivors fleeing inland to walled towns. What remained became known as the Hungry Acres, fields so neglected that even the weeds grew sparse. War didn't just take lives, it erased entire ways of life. The delicate knowledge passed down through generations, from which herbs cured fever to how to prune apple trees for maximum yield, vanished when elders died without apprentices. In Burgundy, researchers found abandoned vineyards where the carefully cultivated grapevines had reverted to their wild, sour state within a decade. The loss transcended mere economics. It severed a living connection to the land that had sustained communities for centuries. Even the rhythms of daily life, fractured church bells that once marked canonical hours fell silent. Their ropes rotted away, leaving villagers without the temporal anchors that had structured their world. Some of the most haunting evidence comes from personal belongings left behind. Near the ruined village of Azincourt in northern France, metal detectors uncovered dozens of pilgrim badges, tiny lead tokens sold at holy sites. These weren't battlefield relics but keepsakes carried by soldiers hoping for divine protection, later buried with their owners in unmarked graves. Equally poignant are the half-finished crafts found in abandoned workshops. A shoe sole never stitched, a potter's wheel frozen mid-spin, tools dropped mid-task when the call to arms came. These objects whisper of interrupted lives and shattered normalcy. Yet amid the devastation, glimmers of adaptation emerged. Some villages transformed their economies to survive. In coastal Brittany, communities too vulnerable to raids turned entirely to salt production, a commodity always in demand for preserving food. Others, like the miraculously preserved village of St. Jean and Gailey, became vital supply hubs, their markets thriving by provisioning armies. The war even spurred technological innovation. Watermill operators along the Loire developed new grinding mechanisms to compensate for missing apprentices, increasing efficiency with fewer workers. The ultimate tragedy lies in what might have been. Before the war, tax records from Normandy show villages investing in communal wine presses and shared plough teams, signs of prosperous cooperation. By the conflict's end, those same documents list fields as waste, their potential yield lost to history. The 100 Years' War didn't just redraw borders, it rewrote the social contract between people and place, leaving behind empty hearths and untended graves as monuments to its true cost. When we walk these silent landscapes today, we're not just seeing abandoned villages, we're witnessing the ghostly aftermath of choices made by kings, but paid for by peasants. The year was 1620, and the village of Scrooby in Nottinghamshire stood half empty, its cottages dark and its fields untended. Among the missing was William Brewster's family, not victims of plague or war, but pioneers who had dared to board a creaking ship bound for the unknown. Their departure was part of a quiet exodus that would leave countless European villages with empty hearths and silent church pews. For every family that crossed the Atlantic, a patch of farmland grew wild back home, its furrows blurring into the earth as if they'd never been plowed. The promise that lured these villagers away wasn't just land, it was liberation from a system that had trapped their ancestors for centuries. In the New World, a farmer could own the soil he tilled, not hand over half his harvest to a lord. A craftsman could set his own prices without guild restrictions. Even the poorest laborers found hope in advertisements like those for Virginia, which promised rich land for the taking to those willing to brave the voyage. Letters sent back painted vivid pictures, forests teeming with game, rivers thick with fish, soil so fertile a single acre could feed a family. For villagers scraping by on rocky plots or watching their children starve during failed harvests, these accounts must have sounded like salvation. Yet the journey itself was a gauntlet of suffering. The Mayflower's infamous crossing saw half its passengers dead within a year from disease and malnutrition. In Germany's Palatinate region, entire villages pooled resources to send their young people on redemptioner contracts, indentured servitude that traded years of labor for passage. Ship manifests from Rotterdam list heartbreaking details: a blacksmith from Württemberg bringing only his tools, a Bavarian family carrying a single sack of rye seed, a group of French Huguenots with nothing but their Bibles. These weren't adventurous explorers, they were desperate people gambling everything on rumors of a better life. Back in Europe, the departures reshaped rural landscapes forever. The English Midlands lost entire communities to the Puritan migration villages like Horbling in Lincolnshire, where church records show baptisms dropping to zero by 1640. In Sweden's Dalarna province, the forests reclaimed abandoned iron mining settlements as workers left for Delaware. Some ghost villages gained second lives as way stations for other emigrants. The deserted hamlet of Killishandra in Ireland became a notorious coffin ship embarkation point, its rotting piers crowded with families fleeing famine. Archaeologists find haunting traces of these farewells. Beneath the floorboards of a Suffolk cottage, researchers uncovered a child's doll stuffed with a note in childish script: "Goodbye house, we go to Boston town." In the German village of Gimmeldingen, wine casks were discovered buried in a cellar likely left by vintners who intended to return but never did. Even the land itself bears witness. Satellite imagery shows abandoned field systems in Scotland's Highlands that mirror exact layouts used by Scotch-Irish settlers in Appalachian hollows, as if they'd recreated their lost homes an ocean away. The cruelest irony, many who sought freedom abroad found only new forms of hardship. The same English villagers who resented feudal dues often became indentured servants in Virginia tobacco fields. German farmers escaping war found themselves frontier pawns in colonial conflicts, yet they kept coming, wave after wave, emptying European villages into the New World's hungry maw. Their legacy lingers in today's ghost towns, where rusted hinges swing on empty cottages, and the names on weathered gravestones match those in Massachusetts church records. These silent places remind us that every great migration begins with someone's last glance at home, and that hope sometimes looks like walking away from everything you've ever known. The heavy plow's iron blade sliced through stubborn European soils with ease, turning fields that had resisted cultivation for generations into fertile expanses of wheat and barley. This revolutionary tool didn't just change agriculture, it rewrote the rules of rural survival. Where once it took 20 laborers to till a field with wooden ards, now 3 men and a team of oxen could accomplish the same work in half the time. Villages that had thrived for centuries on the back-breaking labor of communal farming suddenly found themselves with more hands than work. The very technology meant to ease burdens began unraveling the social fabric that held these communities together. Windmills towering over the landscape accelerated this transformation. No longer did villages need clusters of workers to grind grain by hand. A single miller could now process enough flour to feed hundreds. Records from Suffolk show how quickly this shift occurred. In 1320, the village of Laxfield had 11 hand querns for grinding grain. By 1350, only one windmill stood in their place. The miller prospered, but the women who'd once earned coins grinding grain found their livelihoods obsolete. Similar stories played out across Europe as water mills and mechanical fulling mills replaced human muscle in tasks from cloth making to iron working. The archaeological record preserves poignant evidence of this displacement. In the abandoned German village of Hohenrode, excavators found perfectly preserved hand querns buried beneath cottage floors, not lost but deliberately hidden, as if their owners couldn't bear to part with them despite their uselessness. At Wharram, Percy, the stone foundations of a new windmill were built directly atop the ruins of older, smaller dwellings, a literal metaphor for progress crushing traditional ways of life. Even children's toys reflected the change. Earlier layers contained clay figurines of farmers with hoes, while later strata yield miniature windmill carvings. This technological revolution created winners and losers with brutal efficiency. Lords who could afford the new tools consolidated fields into larger, more productive units, while peasant families unable to adapt drifted toward towns or became itinerant laborers. Tax rolls from Normandy tell a stark story. Between 1350 and 1400. The number of landless workers in the region tripled, even as crop yields soared. Some villages adapted ingeniously, shifting from grain to specialized crops like flax or hemp that required careful hand processing. Others, like the deserted settlement of Thurston in Norfolk, became cautionary tales. Their fields absorbed into neighboring estates, their cottages dismantled for timber. What makes these abandonments particularly haunting is their paradoxical nature. Unlike plague or war, this wasn't destruction but improvement that left people behind. The heavy plow and windmill were marvels that fed growing populations and built cathedrals, yet their efficiency came at the cost of making certain ways of life untenable. Walking through the ruins of these villages today, you can almost hear the echoes of that dilemma. The miller's son proud of his father's new mechanical marvel, the elderly woman whispering that her hands had ground flour just fine for 60 years. Progress has always been a tide that lifts some boats while leaving others stranded on the shore. The lesson written in these overgrown foundations isn't that innovation is dangerous, it's that every leap forward leaves footprints in the earth where someone once stood. As modern automation reshapes our own world, these medieval ghost towns remind us that technological change is never neutral. It rewards and displaces in equal measure, writing its history not just in patents and profits, but in the silent places where communities once gathered to share the weight of the world. While the Black Death left scars across Europe, it was far from the only disease stalking medieval villages. Leprosy crept through communities like a slow shadow, its victims often exiled to lonely hospices at the village edge. Excavations at St. Mary Magdalene in Winchester revealed rows of carefully buried bodies, their bones showing the telltale pitting and erosion of advanced leprosy. These weren't mass graves but individual resting places, suggesting even the feared lepers were tenderly laid to rest by those who remembered their names. The abandoned chapel of St. Leonard in Essex tells a quieter story. its walls scarred with hundreds of tiny crosses scratched by quarantined sufferers, marking days of isolation turned into years. Dysentery struck with brutal swiftness, especially in crowded villages where wells stood perilously close to latrines. The skeletal remains of children from a deserted Yorkshire settlement show stunted growth and telltale lesions, evidence of chronic dehydration and malnutrition from repeated bouts of the bloody flux. Parish records from Norfolk reveal grim patterns, summers with triple the usual burials, often entire families wiped out within weeks. At the lost village of Goldcliff in Wales, archaeologists found a haunting scene. A lone adult skeleton curled around two smaller ones, their bones resting atop a layer of hardened ash. The positioning suggests a desperate attempt to burn contaminated bedding in a final act of protection, even as the disease consumed them. Smallpox's legacy lingers in the pockmarked stones of abandoned cottages where survivors scratched at their skin in agony. A 15th-century burial pit in Suffolk held 17 bodies, all displaying the distinctive bone lesions of the pox. What chills researchers isn't the number, it's the careful arrangement. Each body had been wrapped in herb-stuffed shrouds, suggesting the dead were tended by immune survivors who'd endured the same suffering. These details paint a picture not just of devastation, but of communities adapting to perpetual biological siege. Villages developed grim innovations, quarantine huts downwind of settlements, marked paths for clean and dirty water sources, even primitive vaccination techniques where healers deliberately exposed patients to mild cases through scab powder. The psychological toll etched itself into the landscape. In Bavaria's abandoned village of Kempten, archaeologists uncovered a cellar filled with bizarre witch bottles, ceramic vessels stuffed with nails, hair, and urine, likely hidden to ward off disease spirits. Normandy's plague chapel of St. Adrian displays votive offerings spanning 3 centuries, tiny wax body parts, and silver ex votos thanking saints for deliverance from countless outbreaks. These artifacts reveal a world where illness wasn't an aberration but a constant companion, shaping decisions from marriage seasons to harvest times. Disease didn't just kill individuals, it unraveled the social fabric holding villages together. When the last midwife died of fever, generations of herbal knowledge vanished with her. When half of village men succumbed to sweating sickness, fields went untended even as survivors starved. Tax rolls from deserted Lincolnshire settlements show plunging productivity not just during outbreaks, but for decades after, proof that some wounds never fully healed. Yet amid this relentless assault, glimmers of resilience shine through. The English village of Iam famously quarantined itself during the plague, sacrificing hundreds to spare neighboring towns. Their selflessness wasn't unique, just exceptionally well documented. Countless other communities made similar choices, their names lost to history but their legacy written in the empty spaces between thriving towns. These abandoned homes and overgrown lanes aren't just relics of death, they're monuments to the courage of those who stayed. The mother who nursed her neighbors despite the risk, the priest who buried his congregation before joining them in the earth, the children who rebuilt atop the ashes of their ancestors. Disease shaped medieval Europe as profoundly as war or famine. Its invisible fingerprints still visible in the gaps on modern maps where villages once thrived. When we walk these silent places today, we're not just stepping around graves, we're walking through the shadow of humanity's oldest and most relentless foe, and the extraordinary ordinary people who faced it daily without surrender. Walking along the crumbling banks of a medieval village long-dried mill pond, it's striking to realize how many communities were built in places modern engineers would call disaster zones. These weren't careless choices, they were calculated risks based on immediate needs rather than long-term survival. fertile river valleys promised bountiful harvests, even if winter floods regularly swallowed the lowest cottages. Gentle slopes made ideal grazing land, though their thin topsoil could blow away in a single dry season. Every advantage came with hidden costs that would take generations to reveal themselves. Take the lost village of Tusmore in Oxfordshire, nestled in a picturesque valley that turned lethal when heavy rains funneled water straight into its heart. Excavations show how each flood deposited another layer of silt, forcing residents to rebuild their homes slightly higher until eventually the effort became too great. The same rivers that brought life-giving water for crops and livestock could drown a community overnight. In coastal regions like Norfolk, villages built on unstable cliffs watched helplessly as storm surges gnawed at their foundations. At Happisburgh, the church that once stood proudly inland now teeters on the edge of a crumbling precipice, its gravestones tumbling into the sea one by one. Soil quality proved equally treacherous. The abandoned village of Hangleton in Sussex seemed ideally situated until generations of intensive farming leached nutrients from its already poor chalkland soil. Grain yields dwindled season after season, leaving villagers facing impossible choices: stay and starve, or leave and lose everything. Pollen analysis from the site tells a grim story of desperation. Late-stage deposits show an increasing reliance on bitter, hard-to-digest weeds like goosefoot as crops failed. Similar patterns emerge across Europe, from the exhausted vineyards of Languedoc to the overgrazed pastures of the Scottish Highlands. The most heartbreaking cases reveal villages trapped by their own success. Wharram, Percy's residents unknowingly built their homes on unstable limestone, where underground erosion created sudden sinkholes. As the population grew, so did pressure on local resources. Forests were cleared for fuel, leaving hillsides vulnerable to erosion. By the 14th century, the very factors that made the location attractive initially had turned against them. The mill pond that powered their grain processing silted up from deforestation runoff. Fields that once fed 300 people produced barely enough for 50. What makes these failures so instructive is how preventable many were with today's knowledge. Medieval villages lacked soil science, hydrology maps, or climate data. Yet some communities did adapt brilliantly. The Turpen villages of the Netherlands built artificial mounds to survive floods, while alpine settlements developed intricate irrigation systems to prevent soil depletion. Their successes highlight an uncomfortable truth: sustainability wasn't impossible, just unevenly applied. When we examine why some villages thrived while others vanished, the difference often lies in their willingness to change course before disaster struck. Modern archaeology allows us to read these landscapes like cautionary tales. LiDAR scans reveal how villages like Stanton in Gloucestershire gradually shifted uphill over centuries, their residents learning from each flood. Soil cores from deserted German settlements show alternating layers of rich farmland and sterile dust, the unmistakable signature of overworked earth. Even the placement of rubbish pits speaks volumes. Villages that carefully located them downstream flourished, while those that polluted their own water sources paid the price in disease and decline. These empty fields and crumbling foundations hold urgent lessons for our own era of climate uncertainty. Like medieval villagers, we often prioritize short-term gains over long-term survival, building in flood zones, depleting finite resources, ignoring warning signs until crisis forces our hand. The difference is we have fewer excuses. Where they lacked data, we have satellites. Where they relied on tradition, we have science. When we walk these abandoned lanes today, we're not just studying history, we're reading a survival manual written in the language of stone and soil, waiting for us to heed its warnings. Wharram, Percy's empty streets tell a story written in layers, not of sudden catastrophe but of slow unraveling. The first signs of trouble appeared in the 13th century when tax records note shrinking harvests. Families who had tilled these Yorkshire fields for generations watched their strips of land yield less each season. The soil, overworked and starved of nutrients, could no longer sustain the village's growing population. By 1350, half the cottages stood vacant, their doorways choked with weeds. What makes Wharram Percy unique isn't its abandonment, but the archaeology of its decline. Unlike villages wiped out by plague or war, this was a death by 1,000 cuts. Excavations uncovered heart-wrenching details. A child's leather shoe left beneath a collapsed roof beam, a cooking pot still caked with burnt porridge. In one cottage, researchers found a rusted sickle propped against the wall as if its owner meant to return. These weren't people fleeing disaster. They were families making impossible choices, packing what they could carry and walking away from homes their ancestors had built. The churchyard holds the most haunting evidence. Skeletons from the final decades show stunted growth and dental defects, unmistakable signs of malnutrition. One young woman's bones bore the scars of rickets, her legs bowed from childhood vitamin deficiency. Yet the graves also revealed tenderness, a mother buried with an infant cradled in her arms, their skeletons arranged as if sleeping. An elderly man interred with his carpentry tools, his arthritic fingers still curled around the handle of a chisel. These weren't anonymous victims, they were individuals whose lives and loves once filled these now silent spaces. Economic shifts sealed Wharram Percy's fate. As nearby market towns like Malton flourished, the village's old feudal obligations became unbearable. Why labor under a lord's harsh rules when nearby wool merchants paid cash wages? The final death blow came when the local lord converted the dwindling community's fields to sheep pasture. By 1500, only the stubborn remained a handful of elderly residents clinging to the ruins. The last recorded baptism in the parish register is for a child named Thomas, born to a shepherd's widow in 1520. After that, only the wind spoke in Wharram Percy's empty lanes. Modern technology peels back more layers of the story. Soil analysis shows plummeting pollen counts for wheat and barley in the village's final century, replaced by tough pasture grasses. LiDAR scans reveal how property boundaries shrank as abandoned fields were absorbed by neighbors. Even the fish bones in rubbish pits changed, from plump river trout to tiny minnows, a quiet testament to ecological decline. The village didn't just fade away, it starved, dwindled, and was ultimately forgotten until archaeologists began piecing together its poignant history. Standing among Wharram Percy's ruins today, you're not just looking at collapsed walls, you're witnessing the slow-motion collapse of an entire way of life. The church tower still points defiantly at the sky, but the graves at its feet whisper the truth. This wasn't abandonment, but attrition. Each generation left fewer footprints until finally, the grass grew over the last hearth and the village became a memory. In its stones and bones, we see the human cost of progress, not as a historical abstraction, but as 1,000 private goodbyes spoken into the Yorkshire wind. The parchment crackled as the Lord's steward unrolled it, its wax seal broken in haste. What should have been a routine inheritance transfer had erupted into a bitter feud between two branches of the de Clare family, and the villagers of Ingoldsmells in Lincolnshire would pay the price. For 3 generations, these peasants had worked the same strips of land, their lives governed by the predictable rhythms of planting and harvest. Now armed retainers from both factions patrolled the fields, confiscating grain stores and burning cottages to deny their rivals resources. Within a year, the once thriving settlement stood empty, its fields trampled into mud by war horses and its people scattered to neighboring manors. legal disputes in medieval Europe weren't just courtroom dramas, they were existential threats to entire communities. The complex web of feudal obligations meant a village could become collateral damage in battles it had no stake in. When Baron Mortimer contested his cousin's claim to the Herefordshire manor of Marden in 1325, the ensuing court case dragged on for 14 years. During that time, no rents could be collected, no land transfers approved, and no infrastructure repaired. By the time the king's justices finally ruled, half the villagers had died or fled, leaving the once prosperous settlement a ghostly shell of abandoned cottages and fallow fields. The tragedy lay in how ordinary these catastrophes were. Court rolls from Norfolk reveal countless villages strangled by legal limbo like Sedgeford, where conflicting charters left peasants unsure who to pay their tithes to for 2 decades. Without clear ownership, mills fell into disrepair, fields went unplowed, and families starved despite fertile soil. Some disputes took bizarre turns. In Suffolk, the village of Kettleburg vanished after a bishop and a knight spent 30 years arguing over fishing rights to its stream. The actual fishermen, caught in the middle, simply moved away. Archaeology exposes the human cost of these power struggles. At the abandoned Warwickshire village of Chesterton, excavators found a cache of silver pennies buried beneath a cottage threshold, a life savings hidden during some long-forgotten conflict, never retrieved. In France's Provence region, the ruins of the village of Oppadet show clear signs of deliberate demolition, its stones neatly stacked as if awaiting reconstruction that never came. These weren't acts of war but of legal vengeance, where victorious claimants would dismantle entire settlements to punish rivals by depriving them of tenant labor. Peasants weren't powerless victims in these dramas. Court records from Essex show villagers collectively suing their lord in 1392 over unlawful evictions, while in Germany's Black Forest, an entire community famously won a case against their monastery overlords by producing ancient land charters sewn into a loaf of bread. Yet even victories could be bittersweet. The Yorkshire village of Houghton Pagnell won a decades-long legal battle against their lord in 1420, only to be abandoned anyway when the exhausted survivors couldn't rebuild what years of neglect had destroyed. The most haunting legacy of these disputes lies in the landscape itself. Modern property boundaries often follow medieval court rulings, with straight lines cutting unnaturally through the countryside, marking where some long-dead judge divided contested lands. Parish churches sometimes stand isolated in fields, their surrounding villages erased by legal decisions that treated human settlements as bargaining chips. These silent witnesses remind us that the law, even when functioning as intended, could be as destructive as any plague or invader when wielded without regard for the lives it uprooted. What makes these abandonments particularly tragic is their avoidability. Unlike natural disasters or economic shifts, these villages didn't fade from inevitability but from human pettiness. The empty fields whisper a cautionary tale about how easily systems meant to ensure order can become instruments of chaos when power matters more than people. In an era when legal proceedings could outlast lifetimes, justice delayed wasn't just justice denied, it was communities erased, homes obliterated, and generations condemned to wander in search of places where the law's long shadow couldn't reach. A child's wooden doll lies face down in the mud, its painted eyes staring at nothing. Nearby, a rusted key still hangs from a nail by the doorframe, as if someone intended to return any moment. These artifacts, unearthed in abandoned medieval villages, speak louder than any parchment record about the heartbreak of leaving home. For peasants whose identities were woven into the land they worked and the neighbors they prayed beside, abandonment wasn't just a practical necessity, it was an unraveling of their entire world. Consider the emotional calculus of that final departure. A family packing their meager belongings knew they might never again kneel at their ancestors' graves or harvest the apple tree they'd planted at a child's birth. At Wharram, Percy, archaeologists found a cooking pot deliberately buried beneath a cottage threshold, a ritual act, perhaps, to maintain some spiritual connection to the home they were forced to leave. Similar discoveries across Europe reveal the intimate markers of interrupted lives. A half-carved spoon in a German longhouse, a wedding ring hidden in a wall niche in Normandy, even carefully folded swaddling clothes tucked into rafters as if awaiting a future generation. These weren't thoughtless abandonments, they were wrenching farewells performed under unimaginable pressure. The trauma extended beyond material loss. Medieval peasants understood their place in a cosmic order. Their labor fed the Lord who protected them. Their tithes sustained the church that blessed their crops. Their presence completed a chain of mutual obligation stretching back generations. To leave was to sever that chain, becoming spiritually untethered. Parish records from Suffolk describe elderly refugees from deserted villages dying within months of relocation, their decline attributed to homesickness by contemporary scribes. At the lost French village of Orada-sur-Glane, rebuilt after the 100 Years' War, residents insisted on reusing original hearthstones in new homes, a tangible link to the past that transcended even total destruction. Some of the most poignant evidence comes from how people memorialized their lost homes. In the Alps, displaced villagers carried soil from their ancestral plots in leather pouches, scattering it on new fields in symbolic continuity. Welsh oral traditions preserved the exact layouts of abandoned settlements through songs describing each family's cottage location. The Irish practice of dying eastward, positioning graves to face original homelands, persisted in diaspora communities for centuries. These weren't merely sentimental gestures but psychological lifelines, helping people bear what modern scholars now recognize as profound dislocation trauma. The abandoned villages themselves became repositories of collective memory. Folk tales from Cornwall describe ghostly lights moving through the ruins of Treloihen on stormy nights, said to be spirits searching for lost neighbors. In Germany's Harz Mountains, children were warned away from the crumbling walls of Hohenrode by stories of the Weeping Stones, a legend likely rooted in real acoustic phenomena caused by wind through ruined arches. These narratives served a vital function, keeping the lost communities alive in imagination when physical preservation proved impossible. Yet amid this grief, astonishing resilience shines through. The same archaeological sites that reveal heartbreak also show adaptation, like the Provençal village of Les Baux, where refugees from a plague-stricken settlement repurposed their weaving skills into lucrative silk production. At Dunwich, fishermen displaced by coastal erosion carved new lives as Baltic traders, their nautical knowledge transferring seamlessly to different waters. The human capacity to rebuild after catastrophic loss emerges as the counterpoint to abandonment's tragedy, not as a neat resolution, but as proof that even the most profound ruptures could eventually become bearable. These silent villages ultimately ask us to reconsider what survival truly meant in the medieval world. Physical continuity mattered less than the preservation of identity through story, ritual, and the stubborn refusal to let displacement erase meaning. When we stand in these ruins today, we're not just observing empty spaces, we're bearing witness to the extraordinary emotional labor of people who carried their sense of home within them long after their houses ceased to exist. The doll in the mud, the key on the nail, the hearthstone in the new foundation, each whispers the same truth. That abandonment is never just about leaving a place, but about the invisible seams torn when a community's fabric is pulled apart. Beneath the drone of modern machinery, a team of archaeologists kneels in the mud of a Yorkshire field, their trowels revealing the outline of a hearth last touched by human hands 6 centuries ago. This isn't just excavation, it's resurrection. Across Europe, abandoned medieval villages are being pulled from the jaws of time through cutting-edge technology and old-fashioned detective work. At Wharram, Percy, ground-penetrating radar now maps entire streets invisible to the naked eye, while microscopic soil analysis reconstructs long-vanished meals from ancient pollen and parasite eggs. Each discovery stitches another patch onto the tattered quilt of history, transforming anonymous ruins back into places where real people laughed, loved, and struggled. The tools of preservation are as varied as the villages themselves. In the flood-prone marshes of East Anglia, 3D laser scanning captures crumbling church walls before erosion claims them completely digital snapshots that let researchers walk through vanished spaces on computer screens. At the drowned Breton village of Wise, underwater archaeologists use sonar to piece together the layout of homes swallowed by rising seas, their data revealing how coastal communities adapted to climate change centuries before the term existed. Even the humble drone has revolutionized preservation, its aerial surveys uncovering crop marks that outline forgotten boundaries and footpaths, like invisible ink glowing under the right light. But technology alone can't capture the human dimension. Oral history projects in Scandinavia interview elderly residents whose childhood stories preserve folk memories of abandoned settlements, like the Swedish village of Skramel, where grandmothers recalled the exact spot their great-grandmothers gathered berries near long-demolished cottages. In Ireland, descendants of families displaced by famine-era village collapses sometimes join excavations, their DNA helping identify unearthed remains. At the Scottish ghost village of Lowers, a local school's memory box project collected heirlooms, a rusted kettle, a fragment of woven cloth that became tangible bridges between past and present. The ethical dilemmas surrounding these sites are as complex as their history. Should skeletal remains be reburied with modern ceremonies or preserved for study? How do we balance tourism that funds preservation with the risk of loving these places to death? The Welsh village of Capel Selen, drowned to create a reservoir in 1965, became a flashpoint when activists argued its preserved chapel should stand as a memorial to cultural loss, while engineers warned of safety hazards. These debates remind us that ruins aren't static relics, they're living repositories of meaning, their interpretation as contested as their past. Perhaps the most profound preservation happens in the imagination. Historical reenactors in meticulously reconstructed medieval garb now till experimental plots at deserted village sites, their blistered hands and sunburned necks testifying to the physical reality behind romanticized notions of peasant life. Novelists like Kazuo Ishiguro weave abandoned villages into literature, as in The Buried Giant, where forgotten settlements become metaphors for collective memory. Even video games like Kingdom Come, Deliverance digitally rebuild vanished communities, allowing players to navigate accurate recreations of 15th century hamlets down to the placement of each fence post. These efforts share a common goal, not to embalm the past in amber, but to make it breathe again. When a child visiting the preserved ruins of Saint Jean des Vignes in France runs her fingers over grooves worn into stone steps by generations of vanished feet, she's not just learning history, she's touching time. The true measure of preservation isn't in stabilized walls or archived documents, but in those moments when 600 years collapse into a single, shivering connection. As climate change and development threaten newly vulnerable sites, this work becomes more urgent, not to freeze villages in some idealized past, but to keep their lessons alive for futures we can't yet imagine. When the last resident of the Scottish village of Lowers vanished without a trace in the 1700s, locals whispered of the Green Women, a mysterious figures said to lure travelers into the mist never to return. Similar tales echo across Europe's abandoned settlements, curses spat by dying beggars, fairy rings swallowing children whole, witches conjuring storms to drown entire communities. These weren't just campfire stories, they were desperate attempts to explain the unexplainable, to assign meaning to disappearances that defied logic. Take the legend of Suffolk's Dunwich, once a thriving port until the sea claimed it street by street. Fishermen swore they heard submerged church bells tolling before storms, a ghostly warning from the drowned town. Modern geologists confirm coastal erosion doomed Dunwich, but the supernatural explanation persisted for centuries because it offered something science couldn't: a villain. It's easier to blame vengeful spirits than accept that nature cares nothing for human endeavor. The archetype of the cursed village often masked real social tensions. In Germany's Harz Mountains, the abandoned mining town of Andriesberg was said to be haunted by the Berggeist, a mountain spirit angered by greed. Historical records tell a different story. The settlement collapsed after ruthless silver barons overworked miners until rebellion and exhaustion emptied the tunnels. The folktale preserved the truth in code, transforming economic exploitation into supernatural retribution. Even the infamous witch villages of France, like Aigues-Mortes, often represented scapegoating during crises. When crops failed or plague struck, accusing outsiders of dark magic provided both explanation and catharsis. Some of the most chilling folklore revolves around threshold moments, abandoned villages said to reappear at certain times. Brittany's Wise allegedly surfaces at midnight on the winter solstice, its drowned citizens frozen mid-celebration. Irish myths tell of ghost towns visible only to those with second sight. These stories likely originated as cautionary tales, parents warning children away from unstable ruins, but also reflect profound spiritual beliefs. To medieval minds, a village didn't cease to exist just because its residents left. Its energy lingered, requiring rituals to appease lingering spirits. Excavations at Wharram, Percy revealed odd deposits, animal skulls buried under doorways, coins placed in walls suggesting attempts to close the space spiritually before departure. What makes these supernatural theories so enduring isn't their fantasy, but their emotional truth. When archaeologists unearthed the mass graves of Iam's plague victims, they found the skeleton's teeth stained green, not from magic, but from chewing herbs in a futile attempt to ward off disease. The line between witchcraft and medicine, between curses and contagion, was thinner than we imagine. These legends weren't primitive ignorance, they were the framework people used to process trauma when science offered no answers. Today, as infrared cameras capture unexplained lights at abandoned villages like Pluckley in Kent, or acoustic surveys record phantom footsteps in the ruins of Burgundy's Château de Seyry, we're not so far from our medieval ancestors. The human mind still seeks patterns in chaos, still hungers for stories that make the random feel ordained. These ghostly tales, passed down through generations, are ultimately monuments to resilience, proof that even when villages vanished, the need to understand their loss never did. The crumbling walls of Wharram, Percy, and the drowned streets of Dun, which aren't just relics, they're mirrors reflecting uncomfortable truths about our own world. These abandoned villages teach us that sustainability isn't some modern buzzword, but a matter of survival. The medieval farmers who watched their topsoil wash away after reckless deforestation faced the same consequences we grapple with today, just without satellite imagery to warn them. Their experience proves environmental recklessness always comes due, whether in 1420 or 2040. What's haunting is how these communities often saw disaster coming yet couldn't or wouldn't change course. Take the Alpine village of Pleurs, buried by a landslide in 1618. Geological surveys now show villagers had ample warning signs, springs suddenly running muddy, cracks snaking up chapel walls. But where could they go? Generations had invested everything in that mountainside. That same paralysis grips modern coastal towns watching sea levels rise, trapped between impossible relocation costs and certain destruction. History's lesson is clear. Adaptation isn't about convenience but necessity. The resilience of these lost villages shines through in unexpected ways. After the Black Death wiped out half of Europe's population, survivors didn't just rebuild, they revolutionized. Peasants bargained for fair wages, women inherited trades. The feudal system cracked under the weight of its own inflexibility. When climate shifts made traditional crops fail, innovative farmers in Tuscany grafted hardy rootstock onto grapevines, saving their wine industry. These weren't passive victims but problem solvers facing existential threats with creativity and grit. Their example begs the question, what outdated systems are we clinging to that future generations will view as foolish obstinacy? Community emerges as the most powerful survival tool. Villages with strong social bonds, like Iam's famous plague quarantine, often endured hardships that shattered more fragmented settlements. Archaeological evidence shows communities that shared resources equitably weathered famines better than those with stark wealth gaps. The Norse settlements in Greenland lasted 4 centuries not through individual heroism, but through collective fish storage systems and communal hunting patrols. When modern societies face crises from pandemics to supply chain collapses, these medieval models remind us that solidarity isn't just noble, it's strategic. Yet perhaps the most humbling lesson is the impermanence etched into every abandoned hearthstone. The proud market towns of medieval East Anglia, the bustling monastic centers of Burgundy, the thriving coastal ports of Brittany, all once seemed as permanent as skyscrapers feel today. Their ruins whisper that civilizations aren't entitlements but experiments, constantly being tested by time. This realization isn't meant to paralyze with dread, but to liberate with perspective. If these villagers could face plague, warfare and climate shifts with courage and ingenuity, armed only with wooden plows and prayer, what might we achieve with our knowledge and technology? Their empty homes aren't just warnings, they're invitations to build societies resilient enough that future archaeologists won't puzzle over our downfall, but marvel at our foresight. The empty fields and crumbling walls of medieval villages are more than relics, they're silent storytellers of a vanished world. Each overgrown path and weathered stone whispers secrets about resilience, adaptation, and the relentless march of time. From plague to war, economic shifts to environmental change, the reasons for their disappearance are as complex as the tapestry of history itself. These abandoned places force us to confront a humbling truth. No society, no matter how deeply rooted, is immune to collapse. Yet within their ruins lies an equally powerful lesson: the remarkable ability of communities to endure, reinvent, and sometimes even thrive in the face of unimaginable upheaval. Consider the village of Wharram, Percy, its skeletal outlines etched into the Yorkshire countryside. For centuries, families here weathered famine, feudalism, and fluctuating fortunes, adapting their lives to the land's rhythms. When the final resident left in the 16th century, they didn't just abandon a collection of buildings, they severed a living thread connecting generations. Yet their story didn't end there. Today, archaeologists pore over the remnants of their lives, piecing together everything from dietary habits to social structures. In doing so, they've transformed Wharram, Percy from a forgotten backwater into one of the most studied medieval sites in Europe. The village may be gone, but its legacy is more alive than ever. This paradox that absence can speak so powerfully is what makes these lost settlements so compelling. The drowned streets of Dunwich remind us of nature's impermanence. The mass graves of Iam testify to the courage of collective sacrifice. The sheep pastures covering enclosured villages like Tusmore reveal how economic forces can reshape lives overnight. These places aren't just historical footnotes, they're mirrors reflecting our own vulnerabilities. When we walk their empty lanes, we're not just stepping into the past, we're glimpsing possible futures where climate change, pandemics, or social upheaval might one day test our own communities in similar ways. Yet there's hope woven through these ruins too. For every village lost to plague, another adapted through quarantine. For every settlement crushed by war, survivors carried traditions to new lands. The medieval world was far from static. It was a kaleidoscope of reinvention where crisis often sparked innovation. The same heavy plow that displaced workers also fed growing cities. The same trade routes that bypassed rural markets created opportunities in bustling towns. History rarely offers tidy endings, but it does show us humanity's endless capacity to begin again. So the next time you pass an overgrown churchyard or a lonely standing stone, pause for a moment. That patch of earth once thrummed with life, children's laughter echoing across fields, blacksmiths hammering at forges, elders sharing stories by firelight. These villages may have vanished, but they left behind something indelible, proof that even the quietest lives can ripple across centuries. Their stories challenge us to build communities resilient enough to withstand the tests of time, while remaining flexible enough to adapt when change comes calling, as it always does. If this journey into the past has sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Which historical mysteries should we uncover next? The silent stones of these villages have shown us how much there still is to learn, not just about them, but about ourselves. After all, history isn't just a record of what's been lost. It's a conversation that never ends, and every ruin has something new to say.